The inaugural Disney Lorcana set championships have finally arrived to mark the start of organized play. The competition will likely be stiff as the incentive is a wonderful Rockstar Stitch promo card and playmat. Which begs the question, what deck should you bring to the set championships? To answer that, I've created a tier list ranking every single deck in the meta right now. First up, we have Discard Aggro, which I'll be placing in the F tier. Honestly, I had more hopes for this deck going into the set, considering it has access to both Bare Necessities and Singing Ursula, arguably two of the best cards in the set. But considering Ursula doesn't have very many good songs to sing within Amber and Emerald, other than like Mother Knows Best and Strike a Good Match, and that You Have Forgotten Me, a key discard card within the Emerald Ember discard package in set 2, cannot be sung. This makes it a very clunky pick, especially considering how weak it is to Steel and how relevant Steel has been within the current meta. I really can't recommend this deck at this time, as much as I enjoyed it in the last set. Now, for our example list, we have a deck from R&B, which was last updated at the very start of the set back in February. As you can see, the idea was given up on quite early. It revolves around singing Ursula and being able to sing cards like Bibbidi Bobbidi Boo to get value out of your Lucifer, which we've seen people running in Emerald Amethyst recently, and also discard cards like Sudden Chill, Strike a Good Match for draw and cycle, Bare Necessities for more discard, and then a single copy of Mother Knows Best for some board control. Really, like the Emerald options are quite strong, but Amber isn't adding much in regards to the discard package because the You Have Forgotten Me cannot be sung, so playing that on turn 4 can lose you a lot of tempo, and we're in quite a fast meta. Next up, we have Amber Tiana, which I've put in the C tier. As much as I do love Tiana, her lack of resilience to the ever-present threat of Medusa in the meta makes her much less viable. I think because of this, I think Tiana works best as a tech card and not really as a build around like we've seen in the previous set. For our example deck, we have a deck by Boris Kryshel. We placed 40th at the Disney Lorcana Quest Tour in Poznan, Poland. So they're running a pretty low to the ground aggressive package with Piglets and Lilos and Smees, along with some Cinderellas for some tempo control by singing Strength of Raging Fire, Storm, and Bare Necessities. And then we see our later game threats come in, mid-game threats come in, like Tiana and Beast for draw, and then Kida. This deck centers heavily around your bodyguard characters like Hercules, Baloo, and Prince to protect the rest of your board, allowing them to quest, and Baloo obviously comes with a great effect of even once you've cleared the bodyguard character, you still gain 2 lore when the Baloo is banished. And along comes Zeus so that we can clear some of the mid-game threats of our opponents and hopefully clear out the game. Notably, Tiana and Rapunzel and Joshua Sweet are able to sing this Along Comes Zeus. Coming up next is Bodyguard Aggro. Now, Zach Bivens took everyone by surprise when they won a tournament with this a few weeks ago. It is the cheapest meta deck you could probably play, but the meta's adapted since then, and I think if you brought it to a tournament now, it just wouldn't do as well. So it's rather than the traditional purple steel that we've seen in previous sets being more mid-range oriented, or the new purple steel that we've seen with Jafar, this deck plays a lot more like an Amber Steel Tiana deck because it's setting up multiple characters to quest and Arthurs so that you can bounce cards back to hand, and then protecting them with bodyguard characters like Hercules and the Prince Never Gives Up. And obviously we have our Goat Bounce Goat shenanigans to close out the game. And we've got a few tempo tools like Befuddle to bounce our opponent's cards back to their hand, or Strength of Raging Fire. And then we have our draw engine with the rabbits and the friends, and obviously reduce, reuse, recycle, bouncing the rabbits back to hand. Maleficent as our early 2-lore quester that we can maybe flood the board into certain matchups. And then finally a copy of Sorcerer's Spellbook so that if our board does get wiped, we can still put our opponent on a turn timer based on getting a lore every turn. Sorry, I misspoke earlier. This deck did not win. It got top 4 at the 8K. I don't know if they split or not. But yeah, it was quite surprising how well such a cheap deck did, and it's quite cool to see that you don't necessarily need a ton of money to be able to play this game. You just got to know how to innovatively deck build and then beat the meta, even if you're a bit restricted by cost. Next up, we have Bounce Aggro, or I've been calling it Fast Bounce recently. This isn't as control-orientated like we've seen in previous lists. It's still fairly mid-range, as we do have some mid-game control tools, and obviously we have access to Be Prepared. But this deck's a lot more lower to the ground than it used to be, so that we can be in a control position against more aggressive decks, and we can be in an aggressive position against more slower decks. And just the fact that this deck basically almost has no bad matchups except for maybe blue steel slightly favored and Redfasa is very favored. Bounce definitely deserves its spot in S tier because it's been able to persist throughout the meta and always have a place, always be able to make it to top cuts. If you're really skilled with the deck, you're really going to be able to show that because there's a lot of micro decisions where you can eke out extra points of advantage but end up winning you the game. As for the list here, we have taken the third place list from the recent 10k tournament. If you want a more in-depth explanation of the deck, go check out my tournament report video. But it's a fairly stock standard list. The only notable difference is running 1 copy of Scar and 2 copies of Maui's Fishhook as tech. Next up, we have Blurple. I want to be doing a video on this deck very soon. I've been working on it in the background, and hopefully after this video I can finish it. But I'm going to put it into B tier. I'd say it's a bit better than a rogue deck. We have seen someone make number 1 on Hardcore Ladder with it, and I think it's got some good matchups. But I don't think it's quite into the meta yet. Like, it's got some good matchups, but it loses pretty badly to Ruby Amethyst. I've picked out someone who just got 12th at a 2k with about 300 players, so it's a fairly great placing in a pretty large tournament. Basically, the goal of the deck is to tempo out on board, quest a bunch, get some card draw, keep your resources going, and then close out the game with Elsa's, Manners, and Spellbook. And obviously, bounce goat shenanigan. Now we have Purple Steel Midrange, which I'm going to put into B tier, just like Blurple. I think it's really hard to go wrong with this ink combo. You combine Amethyst Draw Engine and early game board control tools with Steel's heavy hitter and mid-game board control options, and it's just a lot of value packed into one deck. I mean, both Steel and Amethyst have some of the strongest cards in the game, and have had so for a few sets. I mean, the Queen's Castle is the best location released this set, and the list I've shown here is a first place by Zan in the SCGCon 1K in Atlanta. So as you'll see here, it looks a lot like most other Purple Steel lists. A notable difference being a 1 copy of Rafiki as tech, probably to remove an Ursula or an Ariel as it's sung. We have 2 copies of Spellbook to close the game, Goats to generate lore as well. And what really makes this deck strong is just how strong the new set-free steel tools are, and Mr. Smee for early game board pressure, and then copies of a Long Come Zeus and Robin Hood to really control the board in the mid-game, especially being able to shift onto that and turn free. Robin Hood's just one of the most insane cards in the game right now. Next up, we have Evasives. I know this deck is a fan favorite of yours. It's usually in the Ruby Emerald ink combination, but I gotta say it's just not very good right now. Evasives only work when your opponents don't have answers to evasives, and in the current meta, almost everyone is on steel, and even the people who aren't on steel have ways to counter evasive cards like Ruby has with Maui's Fishhook. So I just don't think this game plan works anywhere near as well as it did in set 2 and especially set 1, because people just were less prepared for evasives in their deck building. You could probably win a locals with it, but I wouldn't take this to any organized play tournament, so it deserves its spot in the fun tier. Next up, we have Discard, very specifically the Emerald Steel version of Discard. This is a deck that never quite made it into the top tiers in set 2. It had one player who played it very well, Zero Skater, but it was just not a very resilient deck. You really had to find the combo pieces, but now with the addition of all these extra steel tools like Robin Hood and emerald tools like Ursula, or both versions of Ursula, Emerald Steel Discard is a very, very strong option, and especially with the recent innovations by Specky that got him into the top 4 in Poznan, Poland. And then in this weekend's Faye's 10K, we also had Jared get 4th place in the 10K. So this deck has been killing it recently. It's something you really have to be aware of in your deck building and in your play and in your mulligan, because if you make one misstep, you're going to end up with no cards and in top deck mode while your opponent has a full hand, thanks to the card draw from Prince John's. What made this deck fragile in the last set was that Prince John and Bucky died very easily to Tinkerbells and Grab Your Sword, but now with the Ursula Song discard on a 2 cost, they are now able to counter that counter to their deck, and we see new cards like Friar Tuck and Tiana as a tech being included too, just to add some extra early game pressure. Previous versions of the deck were more mid-range, this one's much more low to the ground. We're looking at Cursed Merfolk, Flynn Rider to apply some early game questing so that you can win out before your opponent finds the top deck that they need. Now we have Jafar Wheel. This is probably the most overhyped deck of the set. People were calling it for it to be banned in the first week, saying that, you know, it was way too overpowered and that the combo was insane. And while yes, the combo is insane, if you can pull it off, you can't always pull it off. And even if you pull it off once, if you don't find another whole new world immediately, you get 7 lore, your opponent clears the board, and then you're probably going to lose from there in a lot of situations. I think maybe there is a Jafar deck that can work. We saw Specky try almost make it to top cut this weekend's Fairs 10K with his innovation on the list. I think the X and 5 Jafar made the deck a lot more resilient, but it just has too many matchups that it basically auto loses into, especially very relevant matchups that we see in the S tier. As for the version of Jafar Wheel I'm showing now, this is a deck by Alexis Duval. They got 16th at a 290 player tournament. I don't quite agree with the Blue Fairy inclusion. My friend at Locals who played this deck in Poznan also played Blue Fairies, but I think it's too weak to just a turn 6 Tinker... well, not even a turn 6 if you're playing ramp, but a Tinkerbell or a Grab Your Sword, basically wiping out your card draw, and obviously Flute Songs, very strong into the deck because they can take out your small stuff with Strength and let the Storm Rage on, and then they can take out your Jafar with Zeus. So I just don't think this deck's a very good medical right now, even though it can pop off and steal games from any deck if it gets the combo, so which is why it's going to stay in the C tier as a rogue deck. Next up, we have Ruby Sapphire Control, or Pawps Control as some people like to call it. This deck has been very, very strong this set, with the inclusion of Lucky Dime as a way to catch up in lore once you've controlled the board, and just more consistent ways of ramp, or experimenting with Heart of Tefiti. And, you know, what kind of ramp do you use? Do you play Mickey's? Do you play Grand Martello? I mean, you always play Fishbone Quill. So there's a lot of room for deck building innovation within this deck. We've just recently seen Buffet 10K take the win, take the championship. But despite that, I'm still going to put it in A tier and not S tier because I think it has too many bad matchups. A discard is a very hard matchup for it because you're not able to ramp if you don't have the cards to ramp with to be able to get enough ink to top deck ways to reset the board, like with Be Prepared. And then just really any hyper-aggressive deck is going to be able to beat Ruby Sapphire before they're able to stabilize and control the late game. So we're looking at like Emerald Amethyst Purple here, or even maybe Hyper Aggro is a very, very bad matchup for Ruby Sapphire. So it is a super strong deck, but I don't think it's quite S tier. You have to make a meta read with this deck. If you think there's going to be any aggro or there's going to be a lot of discard, it's probably not a good idea to bring the list. And if everyone's expecting Ruby Sapphire because Ruby Sapphire won the last tournament, well, it makes it harder to bring because people are going to be teched for it, they're going to be ready to counter it. Now we have Redfasa, which is a deck that I didn't play a lot of in set 2. I was more on Greenfasa in set 2, but in set 3 this deck has been nuts. We've been seeing lots of good Ruby tools and lots of good Amber tools introduced, which has made this deck a lot more consistent. You can just pretty much play to the board and quest in their face and hopefully expect to win. The key weakness really is to steal decks. Redfasa has a lot of very good matchups into Ruby decks, especially because Mufasa is a sticky threat that essentially survives a Be Prepared when it pulls down another character after being banished. Now, Humble did have a lot of innovations on the deck. They smashed me in round 6 2-0 when I was on Ruby Amethyst. They were running an evasive package, which was very hard to deal with, and a quite top-heavy list. They had no 1-drops. Their goal was just to hit the 2-drop, hit the ramp on free. If they don't hit the ramp on free, put down a mini mouse surf with a tempo, and then either heal for cards with Rapunzel, or just put down another evasive on turn 4, another evasive or a Mufasa on turn 5, and then once they get to the later inks, they have control tools at 6 with Tremaine, and then at 7 with Scar. Any of the heavy hitters like Surfer Stitch, Maleficent Dragon, Chernabog, if they can get that off a Mufasa hit, even a Tremaine, or just another Mufasa, this is a deck that's very, very, very hard to deal with. And considering how little Let It Go there is in the meta, there's not many ways to efficiently counter a Mufasa list right now. And Humble has decided to always run 60 character card decks in Redfasa, so you can't hope that they whiff like you can with most lists that run 2 to 4 non-character cards. So I forgot to mention, but because of all of this, I would consider Redfasa an A-tier meta deck, just because of how many good matchups it has and the recent innovations by Humble. Now we have Hyper Aggro. I mean, I think you guys know it already. We haven't really seen anything from this deck except from the very start of the set because we quickly realized how good steel decks were. and Hyper Aggro just hates steel decks. So I'd still put it in C tier. Like it's better than an evasive deck. It's not quite a fun deck, but it's very much a medical. Like if you think your set championship is going to be all Ruby Sapphire and maybe Ruby Amethyst and not much steel, then Hyper Aggro could be a good pick just to steal games off of your opponent not being able to respond to your board quick enough. I also think Hyper Aggro doesn't do as well in best of 2 because you're very likely to win on the play, but you can probably almost never win on the draw, or at least in best of 3. If you can win that first match, then you can guarantee that you'll be on the play for the third game if you do lose on the draw for the second. So I think best of 3 favors aggressive decks more than best of 2 does. Don't quote me on that, I'm not entirely sure. The deck example I've chosen was from the Alice's 2K Easter Special, which had 297 players and they placed 55th. With a very interesting tech choice of the 5-cost action card, 2 copies of 99 Puppies. Whenever one of your characters quests this turn, quits 1 lore. This is very much a win more card. This isn't going to bring you back any games, but it could close out a game quicker to prevent your opponent being able to stabilize with something like a Be Prepared or a Grab Your Sword. Now we have Amber Steel. Don't be fooled by the icon. It may say Flute Song, but I am going to talk about the Lantern version and the Pride Lands version here. While they are all 3 different decks, they're all 3 Amber Steel, and I think their win rates are fairly similar. They're all equally strong. They just have slightly different matchups. So what version of Amber Steel you bring to a tournament, I think depends on the meta read you want to make. Because of this flexibility, and because people do play with physical cards, cores of the decks are pretty much exactly the same, with the exception of Pride Lands, which can be a bit different and more lower end with the curve. I think all 3 versions of these decks will go into S tier. Amber Steel's been killing it recently. Bare Necessity is a big reason for this. Robin Hood's the other major reason for this. And also Shift Cinderella. You know, we've seen less Let It Go's, less Hades, which was Shift Cinderella's counter. So now Amber Steel can actually run Cinderella very consistently, and it's super, super hard to deal with. Only Ruby Amethyst really has a consistent-ish counter with Crab plus Maui or Crab plus Fox to be able to deal at least 7 damage to get past the resist too. For the list I've chosen today, it is the 11th place list from Aaron Rubin, Lorcana Pro in their Fea's 10K, and in this version they are playing Flute Song. This Flute Song has better matchups into decks like Ruby Amethyst and Ruby Sapphire, but might struggle more into other steel decks which are able to remove the flute. Now we have Tempo Bounce. This was my favorite deck from set 1. It was the first ever deck video I did on the channel, and it got really, really good in set 3. This is especially thanks to the Ursula discard, cards like Queen's Castle, Cursed Merfolk. We've got more good 1-drops in Rafiki and Chernobog's Followers. We have Kit Cloud Kicker for tempo control. I mean, this deck really does just have it all. Obviously, with the Singing Ursula, we can sing Friends for card draw, and we can sing Mother Knows Best for board control. Don't mind the Genie as the picture. Most people aren't actually running Genie anymore. They prefer to run Yzma as the top end. This is really just a meta decision. If you need some form of hard removal, then Yzma is a good pick, or you can even use it to draw yourself more cards. Say if you hit maybe a rabbit to draw 3, or just one of your 1 costs. I mean, this deck would usually lose quite hard to grab your sword, but luckily, thanks to Ursula, you do have an option to discard your opponent's grab your sword, the 2-cost Ursula that is. So I think that this deck is a medical, like it does very poorly into Flute Song. It does very poorly into Amber Steel in general, which is very popular right now. So that's why I've put it in A tier and not quite S tier. I think depending on the meta, like let's say you expect a lot of Ruby Sapphire, this is probably the best deck to bring to beat Ruby Sapphire, because not only do you have discard effects, you're also very low to the ground and can quest for a bunch. And if you've got, rabbits on the board, maybe you're running Cuzco's, and even if they do clear your board, you're going to be able to draw more cards and hopefully stabilize. And then, like any Amethyst deck, you have Goat Bounce Goat Shenanigans to close out the game. Next up, we have Greenfasa. This was probably my second favorite deck in set 2 after Sapphire Steel. I'm just so sad to see it's not that good in set 3. I think the only reason it worked in set 2 was because it was specifically good against Ruby Amethyst, which was the best deck in the game, and the power level was a lot lower. But now even Ruby Amethyst has evasive counters with the item Maui's Fish Hook, and Greenfasa hasn't gained a lot of good tools to be able to keep up with their decks in set free. The list we're using is RMB's set free revised version, which they last updated in late March. I mean, we've got some cool options with like Chernobog and Perdita, and we have more consistent draw with cards like Pongo, and the Flynn Rider Cursed Merfolk package works very well, and the nuts line of Pluto into Doc into Mufasa can be insane when it pops off, but again, we're facing a lot of decks with early game board control, like Flute Song, or even Ruby Amethyst with Pinocchios now, so I think it's very, very hard to find the line you need to be able to come out with a win. If you want to play a Mufasa deck, just go play Redfasa. This is going straight in the F tier for fun. Next up, we have a pick that may surprise you. I'm not even sure on it myself yet. This is Mill. I haven't had enough time to test Mill. I want to test it more, but I think it's really well positioned in the current meta because everyone's running a ton of card draw. We're seeing lots of whole new world decks. It's a very steel-centric meta. Emerald and Steel both have access to some really good control options as we're set. I think it's only a matter of time before we see a Mill deck top a tournament in set free. I'm especially impressed with Lyle Tiberius Rurk as a tech choice because his interaction with Be Prepared is insane. Let's say you've built up a board of 5 characters and your opponent Be Prepared's the board, and your opponent loses 5 lore for each because you're losing a lore for each character banished. That's kind of nuts. But what really makes this deck better is that Steel's gained access to a ton of good control tools this set, and we have the Emerald discard Ursula, and we have Morph, which lets us shift into multiple good cards early, like Tinkerbell and Robin Hood and Beast. And obviously we have Sing Along to come Zeus to control the board, we have Grab Your Sword Tink combos, and we have just so many tools to be able to control the board and reach that Mill win condition. And even if it's not a game where you're looking like you can go for the Mill win condition, then with the board control, you can probably just build a beefy enough board to quest the game as your alternate game plan. The deck I'm showing off here, a deck from Team Inkless from the player Bogos. They played it at the Alice's 2K Easter Special, 297 players, and they got 17-9. And for the second to last deck, we have probably my favorite deck in the game, my love, my dearest, Sapphire Steel Wheel Ramp. This deck's just become insane in set free. We're still running bells, but we've added in dimes ever since we saw how well it worked for Ruby Sapphire. We have Mukduk Manor, which is one of the most well-statted locations in the game, which works great as a Be Prepared counter and as a way to just commit resources to the board when you don't want to play more characters. We still have the good old Gastons, but we also can have options to tech in like a copy of a Long Come Zeus or a copy of a Let It Go. We have so much scry with Develop Your Brain. We have very consistent draw engine. I mean, this deck is just good. It has a bit of a learning curve, but once you learn the general lines of the deck and once you learn what to ink and when to play, the deck a lot of the time does just pilot itself. I think in set 2 it was probably the highest skill cap deck in the game, but now the deck list has become so automated to just advance your game plan. I think Ruby Amethyst is probably now the highest skill cap deck in the game. Fight me on that in the comments section. But the list we're looking at here that got second at Faye's 10K charity is actually very, very different to the list that most people are running. It's a lot more similar to the list that I saw Subgee's running. So instead of going for the very strict ramp on free 5-drop play, we have more Fire Cannons for early game board control. I think this is a great pick into aggro decks and into Flute Song, preventing them from running away with the game on the play. We have obviously the Smee, which is very strong, but also free copies of 1 jump ahead, so that we can ramp to a 4 cost on 4, ideally Haram, which sets up singing a Zeus on turn 4 to control the board. Or if you have a Robin Hood on the board, you can even shift onto Robin Hood on free as another way to control the early game against aggressive decks. And then we still have the classic Cogsworth, Bell, Tamatoa, Lucky Dime shenanigans that Sapphire Steel is most well known for. Well, Sapphire is most well known for. Pretty nuts combos. You can, for only 13 lore, you can play a Bell and a Dime from hand and then tap the Dime and instantly gain 5 lore and Fred in 10 lore on the next turn. So the name of this deck really is just controlling the board and then building up your own board and protecting it with Cogsworths until you can close out the game with Dime. Lastly, we have Pirates. This deck was very hyped up at the start of the set. It looked like it had a lot of potential. It had It was the most interesting deck to play around with locations, but I think it really just failed because of a lack of a draw engine. Once you played out your cards, you were pretty much done. If your opponents had ways to answer your board, like we saw people start taking Rise of Titans for locations, then there's just no way you were going to win. It was really sad. I wanted to do a video on the deck at the start of a set because RMB had made some really cool innovations with the list. Unfortunately, I caught COVID. I got sick for a couple of weeks, couldn't make videos, and then by the time I was back again ready to make videos, the meta had adapted and Pirates was no longer good. I'm very interested to see where the Pirates archetype goes in future sets, but for now, it's just going to go in the F tier for fun, and I mean, it is very fun, but I wouldn't take it anywhere but at locals or just messing around on Pixelborn Ladder. What makes this deck so fun, if you haven't played the list already, is 4 copies of John Silver, so we can get Resist and Law, and then a few copies of Jim Hawkins, so we can play out our high-value locations for free, and then we can get some nuts interactions from there. And obviously we have like Shift Robin Hood, which is a very strong card, but our only form of consistent card draw really is Beast Tragic Hero and A Whole New World. And in this meta, A Whole New World is often not the card you want to play because you're often playing against other Whole New World decks where you want to use your alternate forms of card draw so that you force your opponent to Whole New World you instead and lose tempo. So I think this deck could be well positioned in the future and with some extra cards from future sets, but right now it's just a fun deck. Alright, that's all for the video today, guys. I hope you guys are well prepared for the set championships. Please let me know in the comments below. And also, if you're interested in getting better in preparation for organized play, I will be opening up paid coaching sessions to beginner and intermediate players who are looking to get into tournament play. I don't recommend my services if you're already a very experienced tournament grinder, but I do think if you're just getting into competitive guard games or you've never really gotten into the tournament scene before, I can teach you the fundamentals. And for full transparency, I've been wanting to do coaching for a while. The reason I'm opening this up is so that I can fundraise for my own trip to the Lille Organized Play Championship. So just so you guys know what my intents are here, I want to help you out. I want to help you get better.